10, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Minister for the Environment. Does he stand by all his statements?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Yes, particularly my statement that parties that are genuinely concerned about jobs, about housing and about regional development in areas like Northland will support the government's resource management reforms.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Well, does he particularly stand by this statement he made in regards to proposed changes to the RMA and the involvement of iwi in water management that, and I quote him, "I actually think there are advantages for all New Zealanders in these changes," end of quotes. If so, why?
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I think involving iwi properly in the consultation and development of water plans and improving New Zealand's water management. And I, for instance, would say that I think the member supports it as well. I noted that on the 11th of December in
Order. Point of order, the Right
Speaker, I'm asking him about his comments, not about mine or New Zealand First policy. I just want to know, as the public does, what his comments mean.
Order. No. You asked whether the Minister stood by his comments. He's answered that he does, and he was giving an explanation. If the member doesn't
I'm happy to give the member a further explanation.
No, if the member doesn't want to hear the explanation, we'll move on with further supplementaries. Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
That's okay, Mr. Speaker. The joke will be on you, Baldy.
Order. 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 Chris Farfoy, I'm on my feet. Would the member just proceed to ask his supplementary question?
Can I ask the Minister, where is the advantage for all New Zealanders in having the statutory responsibility for the allocation and control of fresh water transferred from councils to unelected private interests based on racial entitlement?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, that certainly is not in the bill. It's certainly not in the government proposals. But I would note that changes were made to the Resource Management Act providing for iwi joint management agreements that also cover water. It was introduced to the House on the 16th of December 2004 and voted in favour by both the member and his party.
Point of order, Speaker.
Order. Order.
Speaker.
Order. I just need some silence from my right-hand side.
Point of order,
Point
Speaker.
of order, Right Honourable Winston
Mr.
Peters.
Speaker, could I have a readout of the proposed law 11 years later, for example, like 2015, rather than something reciting what happened 11 years ago?
Point of order the member's making.
Well, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston
Supplementary question. Can this Minister tell the House what iwi or hapu values are and how developing a range of mechanisms to give effect to them will improve water quality, since that's the proposed objective in a document from the iwi Leaders Group that Cabinet received in July of this year, 2015.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, this government does believe that iwi and Māori need to have an effective say in the way in which this country manages its freshwater resources. And I'd note that that member's party also agreed with that view by voting for iwi joint management agreements.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order,
Speaker,
Right Honourable
I am
Winston.
asking this Minister, can he tell the House what iwi and hapu values are? That's all that's in this question.
No, it wasn't. The member then went on and added about a memorandum that come from the iwi Leaders Group in July.
Point of order.
No, order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. If the member wants to remain in the House to ask his questions, he better
Mr. Speaker, I will not be intimidated.
Order.
I did not ask that.
Resume his seat. If the member had simply asked that, I could have helped, but that was not the question the member asked. He then added substantially more. That gives a very wide ambit for the Minister in answering the question. The member wants a short, sharp answer. He needs to ask a short, sharp supplementary question.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order, the Right
Mr. Speaker, I want to specifically refer to what I asked for, which was iwi and hapu values, since they are in the proposed objective document he received.
Order.
I did not change the question or add to
The
it.
way forward is order. If the member wants to stay to ask another supplementary order, the member will stand and withdraw and apologise for that interjection.
I want to apologise. Point of order.
No, the member now will resume his seat. I have ruled that the question that was asked was very elaborate and gave the Minister quite a wide ambit in answering. That is my final decision on that. If the member wants to ask further supplementaries, he can do so. Otherwise, I'm very happy to move to the next question.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Given that I asked the Minister to tell us what iwi and hapu
Order,
values
a
were...
short, sharp supplementary question, please.
Respectful Speaker, I've hardly got out the first 5 words when you're making a criticism.
And your member should read standing Speaker's rulings and understand that you're not actually meant to ask questions starting with the words given that. Now, if we can have further supplementaries that are in order, we will have them.
Speaker,
Supplementary question.
would
Right Honourable
he
Winston
advise what iwi and hapu values are referred to in a document that the Cabinet received, and will he give the following demands made in this document credence or support? 1, that ownership of all Crown-owned lake and riverbeds be transferred to iwi. 2, that ownership of freshwater be transferred to iwi. 3, that all marae received freshwater infrastructure. And 4, that iwi receive a $1 billion fund.
The question is too long. It can be answered. Order. There was 3 questions there that I deciphered. The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, what I can be very clear about is the government's policy with respect to freshwater, and that is that no one owns the water, that we need to work the issues through on a catchment by catchment basis, and that the final decisions on all water plans across New Zealand will be made by elected councils.
Supplementary question, Marama Fox.
Can the Minister enlighten us as to whether the Wairarapa Moana will be part of the settlement in which the member Ron Mark negotiated on behalf of Wairarapa iwi to return to Kahungunu?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I would want to compliment.
Order. The member has a right to raise a point of order.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, my point of order is that you have been at pains to make sure that the opposition asked certain specific questions, excepting you're allowing ministers to deviate, having been led on by supplementary questions from the government side. Now, first of all, number 1, this is a confidential matter. Cannot be disclosed in this Parliament. That's a breach of confidentiality.
Order.
Although that minister wouldn't understand that.
Order. I'm unaware whether it's a confidential matter. I've got an interjection coming from my side that shouldn't be coming through a point of order, that it's in the public arena, so I can't make a comment.
Order.
Order. I'm on my feet.
Take it.
The question that was asked is certainly in order. It was a longer question than I'd have liked, but it's definitely in order. Further supplementary.
Point of order.
A point of order from...
Order.
I have a point of order from Ron Mark. I'll hear this first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that you probably not possible for you to make a ruling right now, but I ask you, in consultation with the Minister of Treaty Settlements, to look at the obligations of the Crown and its negotiations to keep confidential all matters relating to ongoing negotiations, and that is a clear breach of the confidentiality agreement between the Crown and the negotiators of Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa Tamaki Nui Aurua.
I will hear from the Honourable Jerry Rowley.
Mr. Speaker, you might want to expand that investigation or consideration a little bit further, because if in fact the question from Marama Fox was a breach of confidentiality, then we would be in a position of New Zealand First, in fact, arguing that no other iwi should get the secret provisions that they have been able to negotiate for a particular iwi, and that itself would be a breach of the confidentiality. Mr. Speaker.
Order. No, I need no further assistance. Order. Mr. Mark has asked me to look further in this matter and acknowledges I'm not in a position to make a decision as to whether it's in the public arena, etc. At this stage, I will look into the matter. In the meantime, I'm going to invite the Minister to answer the question. I would expect him, if it is a matter of confidentiality, to state that in his answer.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I've been briefed by the Ministry for the Environment on the proposed agreement dealing with the Wairarapa Moana, change of ownerships and respect for the long-standing relationship that local iwi has. I would commend the member, the Mayor, for his involvement in what I think is a constructive way forward for that water body.
Question number 11, Stuart.